Good evening, everyone. Good to see all of you here this evening. Let me remind the men of our congregation that our rally, our men's rally, begins at 6 p.m. sharp this Friday evening. And so if you plan on attending, try to be here at 6 and we will be able to get things up and going. I know it's going to be a good rally. Our speaker is Wayne Jones, is an excellent speaker. He's the president at the Bear Valley Bible Institute of Denver, and so we're getting the very best from the school, and so let me encourage you to be here. I know he'll have some things to talk about as he talks about being grounded and rooted in our faith. I think you'll really enjoy it. If you open your Bibles to the book of Esther, we began looking at this a couple of weeks ago, and I really like it. Oh, by the way, several people asked me where I got the poem that I read this morning at the end of the sermon called The Third Man. The poem is really not a poem. It's a song that was written in 1973 by Conway Twitty. Conway Twitty was a country music star. He's part of the Country Music Hall of Fame. He's now late, but that's where that poem came from, is from that song. And I'd heard the song, and so I kind of robbed the lyrics from it, and because I just thought it had such an incredible message. But it's 1973, so that tells you that that's the year I graduated, so that's a pretty old song. Anyway, we began looking at the book of Esther. Esther is an interesting book here. Let's see here. I forgot to give you my thumb drive, didn't I? Yeah, that'd be great. It's called Esther Part 2.
Okay, sounds good.
That's okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anyway, the book of Esther is an interesting book, and I think I said to you that when you look at the book of Esther, Esther is one of the more exciting books. That's just my opinion, but I think it's one of the more exciting books in the Old Testament because it's filled with all kinds of curiosity. It's exciting. It's a fast-moving book that it's filled with intrigue, espionage, plots, power plays, pride, jealousy. There's a lot of things that's in the book, and beginning in chapter 1, all the way through all 10 chapters, it's fast-paced and it's moving, and it just keeps on building and adding on to the things that are there. The book itself is written in kind of a different tone than a lot of the books. It's really is a narrative history. The author of the book is really is anonymous. No one really knows who wrote the book of Esther. Many think that it was Mordecai who wrote the book itself. It was written approximately 470 BC, and of course Esther became queen in 479 BC. And so you see that there is a 9-year gap, and the whole book of Esther takes place over a 12-year period that is there. So it's not a real long period, but nevertheless it is the period that is there. It's one of only 2 books that's named after a woman. The other one being Ruth. It's the only one that's writing about concerning the Jews that had not returned to the Promised Land. When Cyrus the Great sent the first of those who had been in the diaspora back to Jerusalem, there were maybe thousands that went, but there were hundreds of thousands who probably stayed behind and never left the captivity. Assyria took in the northern tribes, and then of course Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar, he took in the southern tribes into captivity in Babylon. They melded them together, and as was the custom of the Assyrians especially, they scattered those that they had conquered and taken into captivity. They would scatter them all over their known empire. So the Jews are everywhere. And when you come to Artaxerxes here, and you come to the book of Esther, you have a large part of the empire where Jews were everywhere, all the way from Ethiopia to India, which is a large-scale map that you'll see here in a little bit. Many of the Jews did not go back to the Promised Land. They stayed. They became people who were very tied into the culture in which they had lived. They were no longer nomadic, but they were more of a merchant kind of people. So they changed in a lot of ways who they were. And so those Jews who were in the city of Susa, which was the capital or the citadel of the Persian Empire, they had decided to stay there, and the result of it was they're going to find themselves running into a head-on collision with a fellow by the name of Haman, who was an Agagite that we'll talk about here in a little bit. It's also one of the only two books in the Bible where God is never mentioned in it. The other being Song of Solomon. I don't think prayer is mentioned in Esther as well, but you can see prayer going on throughout the book. It describes probably one of the most serious threats in the existence of the Jewish people, equaled only to probably to the Nazi Holocaust of the 1940s. When Haman was able to coerce Ahasuerus into making an edict to say that on this day of the 13th day of the month of Adar, that all the Jews were to be annihilated, men, women, and children, they were to all be destroyed. That was not just a local kind of edict, it was a province edict, or it was an edict that crossed all over the region that the Persians had control over. And so you're talking about the annihilation of hundreds of thousands of Jews at that time. And of course, we know that in the 1940s that the Nazis also decided that they wanted to exterminate the Jews as well. The book is unique, as I already mentioned, in that God is never mentioned in the book. However, you see the fingerprints of God all over the book. I mean, you can just see him being pictured there and being talked about. And so there's a tremendous amount of value to the book of Esther. So if you're wondering, okay, so what's the value to Esther to me? I live in the 21st century. We're removed by millenniums. I mean, multiple millenniums of time. What good can that book really have for me? And the value is the book in a lot of ways is a parable of our lives. And you'll see if you think about it. We don't experience the dramatic miracles today as in times past, and yet we find what we would call coincidences or chance happenings all over the place that we would call the fingerprints of God. The word that we'd probably use to describe that is the word providence. Now, last week I said to you that one of the key points or themes of the book of Esther is that of providence, where God is constantly working with his people. When you talk about providence, you don't always see it. You may not even notice it. Esther was living in her time, and she didn't notice how God was moving things into place to counteract this plot that Haman is going to use to destroy all the Jews. She didn't see that. Mordecai, her cousin that was raising her as a daughter, he said, you don't know that at this time that you are in the place that you are for this specific purpose. That's why you are here. He had a glimpse of what God's providence was about. We might not know how or why, but the idea is that God is always working. Man may think that they are in control, but God is the one that is working. And even Jesus himself said in John the 5th chapter in verse 17, just said, my Father is working and so am I. He is working. I am still working. Even Jesus in heaven is not through working on our behalf. He still intercedes on our behalf. God is still in heaven working on our behalf as well. So let me give you a definition that is not my definition, but it's one that I think is a working definition for providence. It comes in three different parts. Although providence is not a biblical term, both the Old Testament and New Testament set forth an understanding of God's gracious outworking of the divine purpose. God has a divine purpose. He had a divine purpose for the Jews. What was that purpose? A remnant would be saved, taken care of in order that the Christ would find his advent. He would come through the Jewish people and into the world, and he would save his people. Not only would he save the Jews, spiritually speaking, but he would save all Gentiles as well, and would fulfill the promise that he had given to Abraham over in the Genesis, the 12th chapter. The world and humanity are not ruled by chance or by fate, but God who directs history and creation towards an ultimate goal. God has an ultimate goal, an ultimate purpose in life. And then finally, providence therefore refers to God's superintending activity over human actions and human history, being to bring creation to its divinely determined goal. from the very beginning, from Genesis chapter 3 forward, God has a scheme of redemption that is proclaimed, and that scheme of redemption, or that theme of redemption, carries on from that point all the way to the very end of the book of Revelation itself. So what is the big idea of the book? God never stops working. When he seems as though he is least visible, and you feel that you need him most, he may be the most active of all. And that's what Mordecai reminds Esther of in verse 14 of chapter 4. When you don't think he's working, where you think he is absolutely silent, is when he may be working the most of all. So men may think that he is in control, as we see over and over again in the book of Esther, but they are not. God is the one in charge. And so if you begin in Esther chapter 1, you see that King Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, that he is an incredibly powerful man. He is a man who is rash. He's a man who's ruled by his emotions, sometimes rash emotions. Oftentimes, he makes decisions in a drunken state, but he is a man of incredible power, and he thinks that he rules the nation, that he is in control of everything, but he is not. In fact, when Vashti, his wife, decides not to come to him at his request, he pushes her to the side, exiles her out, and eventually Esther, a most unlikely character, will come on the scene and will become his wife. But he just won't be any wife. She'll be a Jewish, or she will come out of the Jewish race. Now, Mordecai will tell her, don't tell anyone about this, but it's going to be a card that's going to be played later on when you get into the other chapters in chapter 7. So they may think that they're in control. Men like Haman, who are elevated to a high position in the 3rd chapter of Esther, he may think that he is in control, that he has a tremendous amount of power. And when Mordecai, Esther's cousin, does not bow to him, he became enraged, and he thinks that he has enough power to destroy not only Mordecai, but he wants to destroy all the Jews because he hates Jews. He's an enemy of the Jews. He thinks he's in control, but he's not in control at all. God is the one that's in control. Now, I put this map up here simply so that you could see how vast this kingdom is. And so in the 3rd chapter, and this edict is written after Haman is able to coerce the king by telling him that there are some people within your kingdom who do not bow to you. They are people that you can't trust, and they are a threat to yourself as well as the kingdom. They're able to read an edict that talks about the destruction of the Jewish people, and it's written as a law called the Law of the Medes and Persians, of which cannot be revoked. Not even the king can revoke it. Once that it is a law that has been made into an edict and scattered across the land, that's it. No one can change that. No one can change it in any shape or form. And that is an edict that will go from Ethiopia to India, north, south, east, west, the vastness of the kingdom. All Jews would die within the power of the Persian army. So the Jews were sentenced to death. We talked about that description. And like I said, it's the only edict that's even comes close to the World War II and the Nazis' justification for annihilating or to exterminate, a genocide of the Jewish people. Later on, at the end of the lesson, I'll show you a parallel of a man like Haman who promised to have Mordecai hanged, and then himself ends up on a gallows with the same thing happening to one of the Nazi commanders of old. So an edict was given out in the 3rd chapter that would talk about the destruction of the children of Israel or the Jews at that time. What you see behind me is the edict itself. And it says, these were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring or signet ring. Dispatches were sent by him to all the corners of the kingdom's provinces. And it says, the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and little children. Everyone was to die. Think about that if you were in that position and that news came. Well, in the 4th chapter, the news does come. Mordecai gets ear to that, and having heard that, he starts to go about in sackcloth and ashes, and he's shouting and he's wailing, and it comes to Esther's attention. She sees what's going on, so she sends out one of her male servants out to find out what's going on, and the male servant sends him back saying, here's what has been edicted, here's what's going out, here's what is being proclaimed, and we're in some big trouble. If you look at chapter 4, verse 13, it says, and Mordecai told them the answer to Esther, do not think that your heart, that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. Why is it? Well, because she's a Jew herself. For if you remain completely silent at this time, the relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Of course, she says, well, listen, to go to the king without being summoned there, you can die doing that. There's a summons for death even if you do something like that. And so finally she comes down to this conclusion. She says, so I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and did according to what Esther had commanded, who said, tell the people to start fasting for the next 3 days. I'm getting ready to do something really serious here. We finally come down to the 5th chapter. And in the 5th chapter, well, to back up, you remember Mordecai, what's caused this edict to happen is Mordecai refuses to bow down to Haman. Haman is a guy who is super prideful and is very full of himself. And when he walks out and everyone is bowing to him, there's just one guy who will not do so, and that's Mordecai. He refuses to bow the knee to Haman, and it ticks Haman off to no end. And so the question, well, why didn't he bow? Well, because of the law. And it was the second commandment of the law is that, you shall not bow down or worship anything but God. And so he refuses to pay homage to Haman. And Haman, who is an Agagite or an Amalekite, that is his history, out of a racial hatred for him, decides that he is going to make a plot by which they'll all be killed. And the way he does it, he calls all of his sorcerers. I think some of your translations say he calls the secretaries to himself, but the secretaries he's talking about are magicians and sorcerers, and they come up with a way to decide when should we kill all these Jews, and they come up with the date, the 13th day of the 12th month of Adar. That's when it's going to happen, and the way to decide it was by casting Purim, which was a lot or a dice by which they would decide the date by which they would carry out this act. He throws a lot of money behind it. The question would be, okay, where was God in this? Men may think they're in control, but then again, they are not. God is working, though they may not see it or maybe completely get it. Think about this here. Large doors swing on very small things. The course of history is sometimes determined by the smallest of things that seem just kind of going on in the natural course of things. Think about the coincidences or the fingerprints of God in chapters 1 and 2. Esther is adopted by Mordecai, and she happens to be very beautiful. Esther, of all the beautiful virgins that have been brought before Xerxes, he chooses her for his queen, a lady. Mordecai, he accidentally overhears a plot of a couple of Xerxes' eunuchs or guards, and they're plotting because they don't like the way maybe Xerxes did something to him, so they are plotting to kill him. And so Mordecai, coincidentally or by providence, overhears it. He tells Esther. Esther tells the king. The king has those guys executed or hung. That's going to be very important as you get to the 6th chapter. So these are just the seeds of Haman's defeat that's being put in place, though very unnoticed by most. When you get to the 5th chapter, after Mordecai says, you need to go talk to the queen, to the king, look at chapter 5, because he says, you just can't go in there. You just can't walk in flowing robes because you're the queen and say, I want to talk to you. Or Xerxes, he says, you have to be invited. But she's pretty shrewd. Now, what happened on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, across from the king's house where the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house facing the entrance to the house. She's pretty smart. She hasn't been invited, so these are my words, she dolls herself up. She makes herself look really good, and she knows that Xerxes has a weakness. And his weakness is for a pretty woman. He loves pretty women. He has a weakness for pretty women. Vashti was a beautiful woman. Esther is uncommonly a beautiful woman, and so she fixes herself up, and she puts herself in the eyesight of the king. How many times she walked by that place? I don't know. But she walked by enough times that it catches the king's eye, and he sees her. He likes what he sees, and so he invites her to come in. Verse 2, so it was when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court that she found favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther went near and touched the top of the scepter. And so he sees her, and he is encouraged because of what he sees, and she comes in to him. And Esther then, she pleads on behalf of the Jews, but she doesn't come right out with it. Xerxes, he loves her, and he is curiously excited by Esther, and he asks her, what is the request that you want? And she's pretty smart, so she says, here's the request that I want. She doesn't reveal what she's really wanting. She's setting the thing up. So she says, my request, because he says, ask anything you want. I'll give you whatever you want in the kingdom. And she says, I want to have a banquet. And I want to have a banquet as you as my honor, and Haman as an honor as well. And I want him to come in. Okay, I want him to be invited to this. Haman is excited about that. When he leaves the palace after this invitation by the queen that only himself and the king are invited to, he's excited about that. He's thinking pretty good about himself. Listen, he's got a great household. He has 10 sons who are up and coming. They're wealthy. The household itself is wealthy. He has been promoted second only in the kingdom. He's able to get some different kind of administrative things happening, like the destruction of all the Jews. He's feeling good about himself. So you would think he'd feel good, right? But he goes outside the palace, and there's Mordecai. And Mordecai refuses to bow down to him. And that's all he can do. He can't remember any of the positives. All he can do is to register the negatives, and it eats at him, and he goes home to his house, and he starts to whine. He calls his friends together. He calls Zeresh, his wife, together, and he begins to whine about this Mordecai. Nevertheless, all these great things that he whines about Mordecai, and Zeresh, his wife, says, well, here's a good thing to do. Listen, you know he's a Jew. You know you got the edict. You need to build a gallows, and you need to hang the guy. So he listens to her, and he goes out and he builds a gallows that's like 50 cubits high. That's like 80 feet up in the air. Some have said that this is not a hanging gallows. Some say it is an impaling stake that he has erected. It's all for Mordecai to be hung on, okay? So he's serious about that. Because the next day when he goes in, guess what when he meets with the king again, guess what his request is going to be? I want Mordecai to hang on the gallows. We're going to kill them all anyway on the month of Adar, so let's start with him. So he's got it all set up, and he is ready to go. 6th chapter, if you're following along. You get to the 6th chapter of here, and in the 6th chapter, it says, that night the king can't sleep. And so he wants a sleeping pill, and in that day, the best kind of sleeping pill was to read from the chronicles of things that are happening. That's what I did last night. I woke up at like 12:30. I could not go to sleep, so I got up and I read. And I thought, well, I'll read something really boring, so I read it and I'll get sleepy, and that's what I did. Okay, so I did some reading, got bored, and I finally went and crashed and slept. That's what Xerxes does. He calls in his recorders and he says, I want you to read some stuff to me. And so they came in and they read. And as they were reading along, they read about this incident where these two men were wanting to assassinate the king, and a Jew by the name of Mordecai, saved his life. About that time, and then he goes to sleep, and that next day, Haman shows up, and when Haman shows up on the scene, he says to Haman, Haman, what do you think that the king should give to a person that he wants to honor? And Haman, he thinks that he's talking about him. He's got to be that he's wanting to honor. So he goes on and he begins to talk about all the ways that he would honor him. And so he says, here's what I would do if I were to honor him. Haman answered the king. This is in verse 7 of chapter 6. This is the man whom the king delights to honor. Let a royal robe be brought, which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on his head. Then let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor. Then parade him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, thus shall be done to the man whom the king delights in. And the king said, that's a great idea. Verse 10, hurry, take the robe and the horse you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai, the Jew, who sits within the king's palace. Leave nothing undone of all that you have spoken. And so I used as a title, Haman is mortified by Mordecai. I mean, this guy had a balloon being blown up and puffed up. You know, Mordecai would have been the needle that put it and blew it all up. Because now he hates Mordecai. I mean, hates Mordecai. And now he's got to do all the things that he thought was going to get done to him. He's got to do it to Mordecai. And he's got to march him through the street and honor him in every way. And it absolutely mortifies him to do so. And he goes home and whines to the queen once again. God is at work behind the scenes. Now you come to the 7th chapter. And in the 7th chapter, the plot against the rules becomes something personal to the king. Remember, she says, I want to have a feast with you and Haman. It's pretty exciting stuff. So the king, chapter 7, verse 1 says, so the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And on the 2nd day, as the banquet of wine, the king again said to the father, by the way, have you ever noticed how much wine is talked about in the book of Esther? These guys are always getting drunk. That's what's going on here. And because they're doing that, they make a lot of really bad decisions, a lot of rash decisions. And so They're on the second day of drinking wine. And so Xerxes has a habit of making some rash decisions when he is lit up. Okay, that's slang for has a buzz on, or is tipsy, or kind of drunk. Anyway, it says that he says to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Up to the half of the kingdom it shall be done." Then Queen Esther answered and said, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given to me at my petition, and my people at my request." Remember, she has never told the king that she's a Jew. Mordecai said, "Don't tell him. Keep that to yourself." She's never said that before, and now she's letting the cat out of the bag. "For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss." So King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he and where is he who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing?" If you were Haman, what would you be thinking about now? Yeah. And Esther said, "The adversary and the enemy is this wicked Haman." So Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. Then the king rose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before the Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. And when the king returned from the palace to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, "Will he also assault the queen while I'm in the house?" So to him, Haman, Xerxes, he's taking this personal, and Haman, he wants to kill his queen. He wants to kill the very man who saved his life. That's Mordecai. And so enraged, the king orders Haman hung on the very gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Chapter 8. The sequence is interesting because Haman is taken out and he is hung. He's dead. Chapter 8, verse 1 says, "On that day, King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. So the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai over the house of Haman. Now Esther spoke again to the king, fell down at his feet, and implored him with tears to counteract the evil of Haman the Agagite and the scheme which he had devised against the Jews. And the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther. So Esther arose, stood before the king, and said, "If it pleases the king, and I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seems right to the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman." And guess what? King Xerxes does. "I can't do it. The first edict I wrote was written according to the law of the Medes and Persians, and I cannot stop that." That now is in place, but he elevates Mordecai, and he gives us his signet ring. He has power now and can make decisions. So Mordecai decides that he has to get working behind the scenes, but it's not Mordecai, it's God that's working beyond the scenes. And so the Jews are still under threat of death because of the edict. Mordecai, he devises an edict which empowers the Jews to defend themselves. So what it says is that you can't stop the edict that on this certain day of the 13th day of the month of Adar, all the Jews are to be annihilated. The new edict says, okay, you can't stop the edict, but you Jews can defend yourselves. And that's what happens in chapter 9. The Jews on that day can now rebel back or fight back against that edict and defend themselves, and they do. And in the city of Susa, the citadel, they kill 500 people. And later on, they'll kill 75,000 others across the province, and more after that as they defend themselves. However, they don't plunder anything. Now, in the first edict, if they destroyed the Jews, they said, you can destroy all the Jews and plunder them. Take everything they have. They give the same thing to the Jews to defend themselves, to plunder the Gentiles who are going to try to annihilate them. And they defend themselves. They end up killing a lot of people, but it says they don't plunder anyone. And Mordecai is raised to be someone great. And as you get to finally the 10th chapter, or the 9th chapter, you'll have an edict or an institution of the Feast of Purim. And Mordecai is elevated to second only to Xerxes in the kingdom, so he's in a high place. In verses 20 through 28, the Feast of Purim is instituted. The Jews still celebrate this. Now, almost 2,500 years later, they celebrate the Feast of Purim. It was preserved from that day onward when Esther, because of her work in Mordecai, delivered the Jews from annihilation. And so they used that day when they should be annihilated to when God delivered them and they were saved from it. So here's some thoughts that I can tell you in like 3 minutes. God made it possible for Esther to act. Okay, so let's just talk about what are some lessons that we can learn and some things that she did. God made it possible for Esther, but she had to act. She couldn't just stand there. She couldn't just sit there as the queen and being a Jewish person. God can be seen at work in the small things of our lives, even if we don't have eyes to see it. He will arrange circumstances to bring about His purposes, but we cannot be passive as onlookers. He expects us to be busy. We cannot do nothing except God to work everything out. Esther had a critical part to play, and there will become times when we have a critical part to play as well. Did you guys listen to the new song that we sang? That song is about providence. That song says, when you're in the eye of a storm, when everything seems to be against you, even something as terrible as losing your child, God will be with you in it. God will be a part of it. God is going to be active. Keep your eyes open for Him, even in critical times. The key to the success of God's plan to save the people is in chapter 4, verses 12 through 14. Who knows, you have been put in this place for this time. And if you don't do it, God will raise someone else up to save His people. He says that before He tells her to do something. So you can see how God is working. Man may seem as though they're in control, but they are not. Haman looked like he was in control. He was going to hang Mordecai. He ends up being hung himself. It looks like the children of Israel are going to be annihilated. The children of Israel actually do a lot of the annihilating back. They are saved. They are taken care of. Esther had to use the situation she was in. She had to ask, and she had to risk all. Remember what she says, if I perish, I perish, but I'm going to do something about this. But she didn't act without first praying and fasting for 3 days. I'm going to do this, but tell the people to be praying and fasting about this. This was a critical step that enabled God's careful preparation to bear fruit. God has a way through, but His plan will bear no fruit unless we do our part, which may require prayer and fasting. So each one of us is where we are now, not by chance, but because God has been at work in the background of our lives. So you need to watch for critical moments in which you'll be asked to do small things in which big doors can be open. These are the moments are often full of stress and uncertainties, yet who knows whether you have come to this moment for such a time as this. Keep your eyes open, I guess is what I'm saying. That's the story of Esther, God's providence. Man may think they're in control. They are not. God is in control. Let me show you an example of what I'm talking about, how history repeats itself. This guy behind me is Rudolf Hess. He was the commander of Auschwitz death camp in Poland. Conflicting reports in the 1940s put the death toll of Auschwitz somewhere between 1.5 to 5 million, mostly Jews. Rudolf Hess was arrested and made a captive by the British. He's put on trial. At his trial, when he was accused of murdering 3.5 million people, Hess answered, "No, only 2.5 million. The rest died from disease and starvation." He had hung 1,000 on gallows himself. Auschwitz, April 16, 1947. Like Haman, he was hanged on his own gallows. Haman might have warned him, God is in charge. Years later, Israel would become an independent state in 1947. I mean, think about that. He hung hundreds, if not thousands, and ends up hanging on his own gallows. Even though it seems God was silent and not working, God was busy. God was in charge in the days of Esther and Mordecai. God was in charge when the plans of the Nazis fell apart. The story of Esther is simple. God is in charge today. But when the fullness of time came, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as son. You no doubt have heard sermons where preachers have talked about, well, what is the fullness of time came? When was the best of times? And if you think about the road system of the Romans, and when you think about the Greek system of architecture and language and commerce itself, it was the perfect time for the Son of God to come into the world. By chance, coincidence, or God's providence, God working behind the scenes? Are we willing to trust him in a world threatened by terrorism and chaos? Are we willing to trust him in the personal circumstances that matter to us the most? Are we willing to accept the fact that God still has a plan? Are we willing to accept the fact that he has decided to include us in it? Esther, the orphan, was made a queen of Persia because God's plan included her in that place and time. His plan here and now includes you. The question is, are you ready? God never stops working. When he seems least visible and you feel that you need him the most, he may be the most active of all, and that's when you need to trust. So the lesson is yours. I hope that you've enjoyed listening to some of the things about Esther. I love this book. I think it's an incredible book. It's an exciting book, and it's a book that's filled with all kinds of hope for us today. So the lesson is yours. You may have a response this evening that you are so in your heart that you want to make known about to us this evening. If you want to do that, why don't you go ahead and do so while we sing this song.